Mr. Speaker, that will be an ongoing theme in today's debate. Because as side government, we want to shed light on the issue that international financial institutions aren't actually what's best for the countries in the world today. We don't think that just because you're giving money to somebody as an international institution, you are suddenly this harbinger of peace and brilliance and financial boom. Actually, we'd say you have a lot of problems that you're causing in these countries, and it's really on that ground today, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, that we propose this motion. This House would not cooperate with international financial institutions. Now, before we get into the constructive case for side government, we'd like to clear up today's debate with our modeling definitions. By this House, we're talking about the nations of the world. And by cooperate, we mean deal with or make transactions with. Essentially, we would say that countries in the world today, like a Greece or Ethiopia, whatever class you are, would not trade or seek a loan from. Organizations, international financial institutions, like the World Bank, like the International Monetary Fund, that give out money that are not like a nation or something like a publicly owned nation or whatever, that they are a private institution that give out money and those types of things. Not at this time. We'd say that we really have one burden on side government here today to prove to you that international financial institutions cause more problems than they solve for the countries that they lend to. We're going to be doing that with three main arguments today on our front half. Not at this time. We're going to be talking about generating debt. I'm going to be talking about the alternatives. My partner on there is going to come up and talk to you about shifting paradigms. So let's get into this first idea, that of generating debt. So what we see is we have these institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which are privately owned. They're not necessarily accountable to any specific nation. And they give out money to other nations. And ideally, what's the problem with that, right? We would like to say that when you have an institution that is not owned by a country, that is not owned by a conglomerate of people in a state that they are accountable to, we'd say that the people who run that bank are more self-interested and more likely to do things that are for their own interests than that of the people that they're lending to, not at this time. Now, what's the difference between a state being, interested in the state's activity and the international bank and stuff being interested in their own activity? We like to say, for a lot of reasons I'm going to be talking about in the alternatives, we'd see a lot of different reasons for this, but we'd say that it's more likely for someone who's going to put money directly into their own pockets to be able to the owners of these banks and stuff like that, to be giving a loan to somebody that they can't necessarily pay off, right, to give them a loan that they aren't necessarily going to, that isn't going to be helping the other end of the equation by giving them maybe bad interest rates or something that they know that they can't handle. That's going to be something that we'd say is bad for a nation like Kenya, bad for a nation that's developing, bad for a nation that needs money more than it needs to give it out. Would you not agree?
Do you also include monetary institutions like the European Central Bank?
Well, if we're talking about privately owned institutions that are international, we're talking about any of those. So make that conclusion by yourself. So basically what we're talking about here is an institution that is not accountable to a specific nation, that is not composed by that specific nation. So when we're talking about that, we'd want to say that this idea of generating debt, the preference of a nation is we would say we would prefer that they struggle and have to come up with funds by their own accords by stimulating their own economy than have to get money from another place that they can't necessarily pay back. We look to example of, I believe, Iceland. Correct me if I'm wrong with POI, but we'd say that that country borrowed and borrowed and borrowed to fuel their banks, and that was a nation that actually saw a plummet after they weren't actually able to sustain that for a long period of time, because and that's something that harms that nation. We'd say that if you have to end up paying out a lot more than you can actually maintain, then that's a predatory loan. That's something that we don't see as good for that nation. And generating debt and an institution, the premise of an institution to be created for the purpose of giving out money, also to be profitable, is a nation that will also generate debt for another nation. And we think that the premise of a group to be generating debt is not good for other nations, especially when they're privately owned, especially when they're in the case that they aren't necessarily equipped to help the nations in all situations. So I'd say that we'd also talk about this idea of nations nations like Kenya, for example, that don't get the same type of interest rates that a country like, say, the United States would get from something like the International Monetary Fund or World Bank or something like that. So what's the problem? We'd say that if a nation is not getting preference from a privately owned group, then that group is obviously not deemed equal, and that group is put at a disadvantage when it comes to borrowing money, when oftentimes those are the nations that need it most. And when these World Banks and International Monetary Fund type groups are the ones that are putting people that need the money in a position where they are like less able to pay it back or less able to reap the benefits of what the institution is supposed to stand for, we'd say that like those are the nations that get hurt the most, those are the nations that get in debt the most, those are the ones that we need to get out of debt, and we don't see how organizations like this are helping them. We'd say that they're posing a genuine harm in the international community on the basis that they're generating debt they aren't totally accountable for by being private. Not at this time. So we'd say that like the idea of that is like inherently bad, and we want to see a side opposition come up today and justify to us why an institution that is like premised, like its central premise is like about generating debt for another nation, whether they're giving the money or not, in situations like, and a lot of times that we've seen around the world, when nations have not been able to pay that back and like the entire national economy is like caved down, like we've seen in Iceland, like we've seen in situations with nations that borrow a lot. We don't think that these institutions should stand, and I'm going to be talking about the alternatives right now, even when we're talking about generating debt, to like why these nations like shouldn't be borrowing from international organizations. Sure, I'll take another POI from 1.5.
Okay, basically all economic growth in the past has come from either foreign direct investments or loans. You create some debt in the short term to create economic growth, so you can pay off the debt in the long term. Why is short-term debt so bad if you can actually increase your welfare?
Brilliant. All right, awesome question. So like we talk, and I'm going to talk about this in alternatives right now. But like we'd see like the two examples, one short-term debt, two long-term debt. Like if we're talking about short-term debt, I'm going to talk about how like even in the cases that's not entirely predatory, where the people can pay it back, like we'd say that the alternatives that I'm going to talk about right now are better for them. But we'd say that like in a lot of situations when you have a long-term debt or a debt that you can't pay back with higher interest rates, it's like these organizations that are privately owned putting money in their pockets are more likely to give you that situation where and put you in that bad situation. More countries are put in those situations when relying on these international organizations. We don't think that's good. So like talking about the alternatives right now, a nation should make do by means of proper economic stimulus, like investment, like entrepreneurship, like those types of things. If you want to build an international relationship, that's something that's great. And like then that's something that you should do through regular economic growth within your country. But if we're talking about borrowing, like we would actually say borrowing from other nations is a much better idea. Why is that? It's two reasons. One, about building relationships. We'd say that like economically, when a nation like Kenya builds a trading relationship with a nation like the United States, that's a solid trading partner that they have. They can also like branch out to other forms of trade, things that like are good for them, and they can like borrow money and also stimulate other ideas in their economy by like having a nation that they can export to, having a nation they can import from, and stimulate the economy in other ways. But that also builds political relationships, which we also find very important. And these nations are accountable, Mr. Speaker, which is something that we do say is really important. We don't want to see an unaccountable lending partner, and we need to see side opposition justify that entirely and why those people are the best to give money. We don't see that on prop, and we think that's why this motion must stand. Thank you.
All right, I would like to invite Joost Korman, first speaker of the opposition to
We believe that many countries, especially developing countries, are actually dependent on financial aid which is given by international financial institutions like the IMF and like the World Bank. In my speech, I'm firstly going to go into some rebuttal, and after that I'm going to talk about the different international financial institutions we have and that we don't have, and then I'm going to talk about why those countries actually need the support of World Bank and IMF. Okay, so firstly some points of rebuttal. Because they said, yeah, countries are generating debt when they are getting loans from the international financial institutions. And we say those international financial institutions always make calculations to make sure that those countries that they're lending money to can pay it back in the long term. Because it's actually in their own interests as well that they get this money back that they lend to those countries. So it is never that much of a problem that they can never pay such things back, because it wouldn't be in anyone's interest. So that's actually not what's happening. Secondly, a large part of Jacob's speech was about commercial banks. And we say that commercial banks are actually irrelevant in this case, because they're always linked to one country, and they have they are no international financial institutions. And the examples he gave were also about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and those are actually international financial institutions that are not profit-oriented and that are accountable, and they have a different goal in order to help those countries that they're giving loans to. So we say those are actually the more relevant cases that I'm also going to talk about in my speech, and those were the examples also that were given by opening GAF. No, thank you. So what kind of institutions do we have, international financial institutions that we're talking about in this motion? Firstly, we have the monetary institutions like the European Central Bank, which was also included in opening GAF's definition, and we say, okay, if it would be about that, we already have practically won this debate, because if we wouldn't have something like the European Central Bank, there would be no means to keep the value of the euro stable, then Greece would have quitted the euro and the European Union long ago, and then we would have huge problems within the European Union. We say that is so fundamentally important that those monetary institutions that we really need that, and we should cooperate with them. But then the more interesting part of the case were the development institutions that were also the examples that were given about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, because that is more of an interesting case. What do those organizations do? They're giving loans to mostly developing countries who need those loans, and in order to get those loans, they have criteria that those countries have to meet. Two things. Why do we need those criteria? What are those criteria? Secondly, why do those countries actually need those loans, and they do more good than harm to those countries? So firstly, about those criteria. But first, yeah, go ahead.
So when we're talking about a nation like, for example, Kenya, that does need a lot of money and help or whatever, why is it that that country is given interest rates that are like a lot less beneficial to it than a country like the United States? How is that fair? How does that help?
Okay, that's fair, because there's so much higher risk if you give a loan to such a country, because the chance that they will pay it back is far smaller. And actually, if we wouldn't give those loans through the IMF and through the World Bank, they wouldn't have any means to invest in things that I will go into that in my constructive as well. So they wouldn't have any means to invest in things like that, which are actually crucial to the economy of such countries, as was acknowledged by opening government. So firstly, why do we have those criteria that are given by those international financial institutions? We see that in many development countries that we have a government structure which might not be perfect. In some countries it might, for instance, be because of corruption. So if the World Bank, for instance, would give such a loan and there would be corruption, they can't make sure that the money actually comes to the right place. So we need criteria for that, so we can actually have checks and balances to make sure that they build a school, if that's what we give money for, and things like that. And World Bank and IMF have the means to make sure that things like that happen. They have the means to check on those countries, which private investors and commercial banks don't, so they would never invest in such countries. So you see, that is one way why those criteria are really relevant. Secondly, we also have criteria that there should not be trade barriers in this country that is given a loan. Why is that? Because those countries shouldn't have unfair competition. Because many of those countries, because actually you get sort of subsidized in order to make investments in your country. So like that, you have an advantage for products that are developed with that money in your own country, for instance, for agricultural equipment. And if you would also have trade barriers, then importing such agricultural equipment from, for instance, Europe would be really, really expensive. So no one in that country could afford things like that, which would cause problems like the country itself having no incentive to innovate, to make actually proper products, because people in that country will buy those products anyway, because it would be too expensive to import them from Europe and from other countries. So we say those trade barriers are really relevant, and so no trade barriers is very relevant, and things to make sure money comes to the correct place are really relevant, and those are things that that international financial organizations can make sure of, and other organizations can't. So why do those developing countries actually need those loans? we see in order to have economic development, to grow as a country economically, you need something of investment. And it could be savings or stored capital, and that's what we saw in history, for instance, after the Second World War with Japan, where so many savings that they could invest a lot of that into the economy of the country to start businesses and to develop products. That was a really huge economic growth in that period. But developing countries do not have those means to develop as a country. So they need a foreign investment in order to make sure that they can actually have agricultural equipment. Because if you keep an ox to gain your harvest, you can never have economic growth, because it is far more inefficient than other countries who do have better means. So in that way, we see that they actually need those investments. So we should cooperate with international financial institutions to actually keep economic growth in the entire world. So please vote opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, what I'm going to be doing for you today is going to in-depth rebuttal what we've heard so far from side opposition. I'm going to be bringing forth my constructive point of analysis, which is essentially a debt analysis, and showing how the alternatives that we've provided are actually better for these developing countries. And then I'm going to go into rebuilding, showing how my partner's points were not adequately rebutted and how they still stand. So, we see side opposition, and essentially what they told us so far is that they laid out a criteria for what the World Bank used. We said, okay. And then their second point was about why they needed the support. So, like, in terms of the first thing, what he said first, like he said that there's a criteria for world banks. They're ensuring a lack of corruption. There's no trade barriers between the countries that they loan to, and like they really want the countries that they loan to be really good countries, developed countries, and the countries that they believe are sustainable. What they've essentially depicted to you is like the prototypical Western liberal democracies, such as the United States, England, like France, countries like that. We said the developing countries that actually need the money aren't in these situations. If you look at a place like Kenya, yeah, there's corruption. You look at all these developing countries, there's intense amounts of corruption, which is why they're not getting the money that they need, Mr. Speaker. No, thank you. We essentially see that the countries that need the money have these problems. And so if the World Bank is and international monetary funds are going through and filtering out these countries, then no one's actually helping these countries. And the countries that need the help that they've said, need the money, aren't getting the money. What we also say is like there are alternatives for countries like this that we've provided out, right? Because like if a country like Kenya or Ethiopia was to make trading partners with the United States, that not only do you have economic support, but you have a mentor in the United States. We said that's extremely important, and it goes into their second point, which is why they need the support. They can grow economically, and they're saving for investments, and they need investments and whatnot. What we say to that, Mr. Speaker, is that you can give a man a fish and feed him for a day. You can teach him how to fish, feed him for a lifetime. If you give Kenya billions or millions of dollars, what are they going to do with it? Clearly, they're in a bind. They don't know what they're going to do with it, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, if you look at a developing country, like they don't have the social programs set in place to actually make an impact with the money they get, right? There's a big difference, and you can see it. They're intangibles because if they knew what to do with it and they knew how to make that change, they would have made the change already, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, there's an issue. Clearly, they need that mentor, which we provide in our alternative. We also, right? So we see like in terms of support, there are other alternatives that we've provided. We feel that this isn't the best way. In fact, we feel that this is a harmful way because all they're going to be doing is increasing their debt. Like clearly they're in debt as it is, and they're just going to a deeper hole. Because if they knew how to get out of their debt, they wouldn't be a developing country, Mr. Speaker. Right? So like, yeah.
Even Western liberal democracies, like for instance the US, every Western European country has a national debt that is over 60% of the GDP.
Thank you very much. But there's a reason that they're also developed countries. Like they've clearly shown and proven that they're able to be relied upon and that can pay back their debt and whatnot. Like there's a big difference between the United States and Kenya. We feel like they're just nitpicking at details. We feel like what we've said actually stands. So in terms of debt analysis, like why is debt bad for these countries? We can establish that like debt is a long-term thing for these countries because they're not going to pay back these loans fast. We say like a country like Somalia and And it ties into my rebuttal, essentially. Is like, a country like Somalia or Kenya isn't going to know what they're going to do with billions of dollars or millions of dollars in a loan, right? We see that, like, no, thank you. We see that, like, clearly there's an issue right now because they're a developing country, they're economically unstable, they're politically unstable, but in the end, these are the countries that need the money, they're the ones that need the support. So what we say is that through our model, if you give a country like Ethiopia the mentor, like in the England, for example, in the United Kingdom or the United States, where they can get not only economic support, but, like, have a mentor and someone to follow, that's extremely important. I feel like that's actually much more beneficial than getting money from the World Bank and just having, and because due to the corruption, having it lost. No, thank you. They came up here, so my partner came up here, and onto a little bit of rebuilding, my partner came up here and talked about generating debt, how there's a problem with the premise of privatized lending institutions to international, to countries. And he was talking about how they're privately owned, how they give out money, and that they're institutions run by private individuals, how they've proven that they've been biased to countries like the United States, and they give, extremely high interest rates, so that, like, countries, developing countries such as Kenya and Ethiopia are, like, long-term in debt, and they have something to owe because banks do capitalize on debt. No, thank you. And that the countries that need it most are taken advantage of. He came up and he brought up the Iceland example, how, like, countries borrow, and they eventually fall through. In response to that, they essentially said that they make calculations to ensure loans are paid back, and that commercial banks are irrelevant. What we first say to that is that, like, what you have to understand is that the World Bank, for example, is privately held. So, like, while their intrinsic sort of purpose isn't to generate maximum profit for their owners, they're still privatized. So, like, you can tell it's by human nature that they're engineered to ensure that they are successful, right? They're not going to go out on a limb and sacrifice themselves and give out a loan at an extremely small interest rate to a country that they don't think can pay back. No, thank you. What we also say to that is that, like, banks capitalize on debt. So that the banks try to ensure that there's long-term debt because they have a long. Because of debt, banks can make maximum revenue long term because they're constantly being paid back in slow amounts, and they like to capitalize on that. No, thank you. On our second point about alternatives, we talked about how we can justify not borrowing from the World Bank over debt because there are other international relationships, economic trading partners. He came up here and he talked about how they can diversify their economy and build political relationships. And there's still that notion of accountability because if you look at Greece and the European Union. No, thank you. When Greece fell through, the European Union backed them up because they knew that they were a good trading partner. We said, like, building those relationships within the global society is an extremely important thing, Mr. Speaker. So even when one leg falls, when the weakest link falls, everyone is there to pick them back up. I feel like that's extremely important. And having the World, because if they were on their own with the World Bank and then they fell through, there's no one there to pick them back up and help them. We feel that our model ensures that countries don't fall through. We feel that our model ensures that we have a united global society where we can help everyone become economically developed, and everyone has the chance to thrive and become a fully developed country. So for the reason that I've given, we are proud to propose.
In my speech, I'm going to give some debt analysis about how debt is not a very bad thing, how it's very essential for economic growth. It has been so in the past 100 years. But before that, several points of rebuttal, and even before that, I want to clarify a couple of things about a very weird image that first proposition is sketching here about, one, the developing world, secondly, the international financial world of this moment. One, not every developing country is completely incapable and completely corrupt and cannot handle their debt, right? Yes, there have been a few examples of cases that actually have been bankrupt. They are not the rule, they are the exception. We believe it's completely irrelevant to just put all developing countries, just put them like they're all corrupt, they're all incompetent, they can handle themselves without some kind of colonialist mentor hanging over them, right? We believe that's, first of all, completely unfounded, hasn't been analyzed very depthly. Secondly, slightly racist. Secondly, about the international financial world, right? They keep saying that the World Bank is a privatized institution. It is not in the sense of a commercial bank. It is very strong state backing, right? If they, for instance, fail, they get state backing. The money from the World Bank is supplied by state backing. And thirdly, they have no like shareholders nor a profit, any profits in that are credible shareholders. So they don't have to only give loans that are profited. Instead, they have a non-profit goal, namely to help countries develop. That is why the World Bank was created by all these nations. So this kind of image they are sketching of the World Bank being a commercial institution is completely off the mark. And by that also, that's about 60% of their case, right? Some other rebuttal. First of all, they say, well, there's too much corruption. That's why World Bank will never invest in those countries. Well, if that was true in the status quo, the World Bank would do nothing at all, and they don't. So that analysis was completely unnuanced and off the mark. What happens instead is that because of that corruption, private investments are too risky. Because if I, for instance, was very rich, I would invest, and it would disappear due to corruption, I'm go broke, right? I don't have this state-supported fail-safe. However, the IFA, like international financial institutions like the World Bank, can invest in these countries because they have like this fail-safe mechanism and these like safeguards, right? Because they say, all right, you need like, for instance, a strong institution that can handle that corruption. And if you can't handle that corruption, right, the money disappears. And now they say, so the money would definitely disappear. But we see in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, that that does not happen. Why does that not happen? Because it is in the interest of corruption not to be too corrupt. For instance, if you always take like 20% of the money and 80% still goes through, we can live with that and you get richer as a corrupt official. If you take all the money, we take away, like, we stop our subsidies and you lose that corruption income. So even in those countries, it's better for them to stay a little corrupt, which allows us to slowly take down this corruption step by step. That is what the World Bank is doing, right? And because there is a little corruption right now, first proposition would say, let's just go down with it and let's place a mentor over that part, right? That's my second point of rebuttal, right? Because this whole mentor thing, right? First of all, we say that's not necessarily different from the control we already have and the criteria we already set, so that their alternative isn't really that different for one special thing. Like a mentor implies that there's like this unequal relationship. So the only thing they're going to create is a backlash, right? No other advantage except a backlash from this country who feels belittled by this Western European and Western democracies who say, we'll solve your financial institutions. Generally in the past, colonial nations did not very much like that. I don't really think these nations will very much like being mentored again by their former colonial masters, right? Alright, continuing my rebuttal, right? They say, well, investments, they can't handle them, they don't know what to do with the money. Well, first of all, we would say there has been no analysis on that point. Secondly, we don't see that when we give them investment, they all buy a Lamborghini and then starve to death. We see they actually do know things, like they have like an oxen plow. No, instead they buy like McCormick's Reaper, and as a result they can increase production. We see actually that these investments are yielding results, right? Schools, education, better capital investments, right? I'll go into that in my constructive part. So we don't see that part. And then my final point of rebuttal, no, 2 more points of rebuttal, right? First of all, accountability, right? The Greece example is it. That's our example. That's really why we win this case. Well, actually, Greece is our example because the only reason Greece is still here is not because they're such a good trading partner. It's because the IMF, the World Bank, and the ECB, international financial institutions, are keeping them up, and are helping them in a program to sanitize their state financial situation. It's exactly these IFIs and their cooperation by Greece with these IFIs that's the only thing that's keeping Greece from going bankrupt. So if they really love Greece, there should really be opposition in this case. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, but don't you think like all of the money we're putting into keeping Greece afloat is actually harming the global community on a whole?
No, I don't think so, because if you don't keep Greece afloat, the euro falls and the entire eurozone would go badly into debt. Everybody would be screwed over. So maybe not for Canadians, but as Europeans, we would be really screwed over. That's right. So my final point of rebuttal was, they're going to get out of debt. I'll go into that in my constructive. Going on to my constructive, why is debt not such a bad thing? Joost already started on this point, but we see that generally there are like 3 parts of economic growth. Right? You have labor, you have land, you have capital investments. And the developing countries have a lot of the first two. They have a lot of labor, have a lot of land. That's why they're generally agricultural economies, because they can't really invest like with capital goods. And we see that these capital investments have been in the past always the key to strong economic growth. Because as soon as you get like capital goods, like a reaper, instead of an oxen plow, you can dramatically increase your production, increase your income, and thereby increase your welfare. Pay for your children to have an education and increase the general welfare of a country, which allows you to build better institutions. Now we see in developing countries, as I and Joost already explained, that it's too dangerous for like foreign direct investment, too risky, and that they don't have the savings that allowed Japan to make its miraculous recovery after World War II. So that money, if we want them to develop, needs to come from somewhere. And that is why international financial institutions are that important. Because the free market in this case says, no, that's too risky, we can't get a profit, so we'll just leave you there and starve. starve, right? We don't like that. We believe that it's like, especially because of the discrepancies between the wealth in the world, there's like this moral role that is of Western nations, which it's put in this World Bank part, which allows them to actually have financial investments with the state-sponsored backing, which actually allows like investments going into these countries, right? And then their part is, yes, we put investment in those countries, but they never can get out of debt. Several points on that. One, national debt isn't a bad thing. The reason why Western countries are so rich right now is because they went into debt to make sure they could get investments that allowed their economy to grow. That's why pretty much every nation in the Western world has about a 60% like debt, national debt. That's fine for nations in developing countries as well, because as a result of that debt, they can actually grow their national income, right? That national income allows them like to pay for more things, like more capital goods, but also education, more welfare, sanitation, hygiene, all of those things. Increase the living standard of these people. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what we believe should be the true goal in this debate. What actually increases the living standards of these people. And what we have shown you on first opposition is that actually the living standard increases in the status quo because they can get economic growth due to these foreign direct investments. While in their world, they will probably either really don't change anything in their alternative except for a backlash, or otherwise they will cut off all the funding, leave them there without capital investment, gone economic growth, gone growth in social welfare and things like that. We believe that's a bad thing, and that's why you should vote first opposition.
We think that the whole world wants to develop. That's our ultimate goal, to have developed countries all across the globe. We think that that's something that side proposition and side opposition can both agree on in today's debate. The thing we disagree on today is the method of getting there. Now today I'm going to be bringing to you the extension from back half proposition about why we think that this is actually going to be a greater harm to like the global community involving every single country because of the nature of relying on international investments, seeing as we think it's kind of a sinking ship when someone messes up. But before that, I'm going to get into a bit of rebuttal. So let's just look at what we've heard from side opposition today in their second speech. Now we basically heard this idea of debt is good. They told us that every single developed country, well, they have a lot of debt, and we think that's great because getting the debt is what gets you the money, and that way you can develop. We have a few responses to this. One of them would be we don't think that a lot of countries can pay back that debt in the time that they need to pay it back. Now what we would say is when a developed country gets debt, and here's where it's different. When they gather debt, the thing is they can put the money that they borrowed into developing infrastructure, into the economy, into boosting the country, making that money back, handing it back to the World Bank. We think that that's a fundamental difference between them and a third or like a developing country, because here's the thing. When you give them money, a lot of that money is going to go to just the bare minimum. It's not actually going to go to development because they need to keep people alive. That's the, no thank you. That's the ultimate goal, is keeping your country alive, making sure people have enough money, like money to buy food, making sure people can at least live. But the thing is to actually have enough money to develop infrastructure, to develop a strong economy, to develop like buildings and roads, no thank you, and systems that like govern the country properly. First, you need to have the basis, and we think that to like afford this, they would have to have so much money, they would have to borrow so much that it would put them in a debt that they could never truly recover from. We think that the way that they've been scraping by for so long is by borrowing a bit of money, getting a bit ahead, then falling behind when they have to pay it back. We think that the ultimate solution is actually not relying on the World Bank, it's relying on the other countries around them, using trade. It's about like cooperating, no thank you, as an international community instead of relying on one like non-political company that's lending out money to every country in the globe. We think that that's like the ultimate harm in this. So we've also heard this idea about like, we think that because people are corrupt, well the money's, I'll take you in a moment. We think that when people are corrupt in these third world countries, no thank you, I'll take you, just let me finish. When people are corrupt in these third world countries, we think that they like aren't going to actually take any of the money because the World Bank still wants to see the money getting out there. We don't see that's true. We think that in a lot of cases when we support countries, like even like just in general as an international community, not solely just as a bank, we think that the money like might not go to where it's intended, but especially when it comes in there. For example, when we all sent aid to like, let's look at Haiti, a lot of that money ended up lining someone's pockets. A lot of people were living in tents a year later. No, thank you. Yes, please.
So perhaps you want to see, big countries like China and the U.S. pretty much influencing and making, African countries into their vassals because of political agendas. That sounds great, doesn't it?
Okay, we think that, yeah, it's kind of a concern when you have someone lending out money that they're going to end up being like a puppet state of this person. We recognize that concern, but at the same time, we think there's a reason why China and America are so successful. We think it's because they know what they're doing, they know how to run a stable economy, and they have had a good development. We think that, like, if they're going to help these countries, we think that, yeah, there may be a bit of that, but ultimately we see that the money can help them develop. We think that that's our ultimate goal, and once they actually have enough money to develop, no thank you, the basis of their system, we think that at that point they can have an economy that they, like, base themselves on. We think they can support themselves. We don't think they need to have this reliance, but no thank you, we don't think the World Bank is the right way to get that started. And so with this, we're actually going to move back into my extension today, and we're going to look at how this is going to affect not only these developing countries, but the developed countries, no thank you, and the global community. Now, we think that the main problem with financial institutions is not the fact that it's a financial institution, it's the fact that it's an international financial institution. We think that when you have an international financial institution, that means that every single country in the world, or like a large majority of them, are all cooperating with this one institution. Now, what do we think happens? We think that when countries need money, they're asking for money. We think this builds a dependence. When several countries have a dependence, no thank you, on this one institution, we see the dire consequence of what's going to happen when one country fails. So we're going to bring an example and then draw parallels between that and the situation that could happen by talking about America. Now, a few years ago, we think they had like a huge recession. We think that there were several banks in America that, like, because the people couldn't have enough money, the banks went under. They weren't actually, no thank you, able to pay their investors back. They weren't actually able to give people all the money they had stored in that bank. And what resulted in was a lot of people without monies and a lot of houses, no thank you, for sale all across America. We think that this is going to happen on a global scale. We think that when one country goes under, because we are all cooperating in this like international system and using this like international bank, when one of them goes under, we think the rest of them are affected. We think that, like, if say one of the countries, no thank you, in like Europe starts being able to not pay back their debt, we think that the World Bank suffers. We think that the rest of us suffer because we can't get enough money from them that we need, that we have become dependent on. But furthermore, we think because someone's going to have to pay that back. Someone, no thank you, is going to have to continue like investing and keeping the World Bank afloat. We don't think that's what we want to happen. So furthermore, let's just look at this idea of like the Eurozone. Now, we've heard this debated back and forth a bit, like, oh, Greece, is this a prop point, is this an op point? We're going to look at the fact that the reason Greece is still afloat is because they're part of the Eurozone. Everyone is putting money into keeping them alive because apparently they need them for the international community. We think that's what happens. We think if, say, America, not that this is going to happen, they're a pretty big country, but if they went bankrupt, we think that the rest of the countries who are investing in the World Bank, who are like getting money and giving money to the World Bank, will have to make up for that. We think that they're going to have to continue paying back the debts that America is racking up when they start to fail. We think that when one country or one state or one person in a banking system starts to lose money, the rest of us pay the repercussions. So because we don't think that's fair to the developed countries, to the World Bank itself, but also to the developing countries who can barely pay back their own debts, we think that this resolution is ultimately going to cause so many more harms than it could ever provide us benefits. And it's because of this that we are so proud to propose the resolution. Thank you.
Right now, I would like to invite first the speaker of the closing opposition.
So instead of having a fancy intro, I'm just going to jump into it because there's so much to say. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the benefits of having a cooperative financial system on a global scale. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about representation within the global commercial system. But before that, let me just go through some rebuttal about some nonsense we've heard from this side so far. Firstly, the US and China stable economies? Hell no, hell no. Like, come on, just look at the news for the last decade. The US is not a stable economy. They don't have stable financial systems. They pretty much have the largest debt of any Western country, and they don't have any, like even the individuals in the US don't have financial responsibility. I mean, come on. Like, the average American has less than $500 in the bank account by the end of the year. That's horrible. Then we have China, which is going too fast. Like, essentially, like, their economy is going so fast, they need to slow down. Like, you just read The Economist, you'll understand why. Anyways, then we have this entire idea of, like, dependence on, like, one institution. This is complete bullshit. Like, the thing is, like, we're not talking about one single global institution. We're talking about several. We're talking about, you know, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, as well as regional institutions like you know, that just focus on South America or, you know, Asia or Europe. We think that includes, like, is included in their definition. And we think that all of these institutions have specific goals of regional improvement within those areas. Like, either if it's just one continent or if it's on the globe, we think that's a good thing. Then lastly, this entirety of, like, oh, the US is racking up debt or whatever, like, you know, China buys debt. Like, that's somewhat, like, you know, mutually beneficial. Like, we don't see that as a problem anyways. So anyways, moving on to this idea of, like, the benefits of a cooperative financial system. Like, we've heard a lot from opening opposition so far, and we think it's good, but, like, we're going to go deeper. Like, we think that when you have a cooperative financial system, we think that there's a diversified risk. By having members from around the world, they can pool their resources, they can diversify the risk and spread it out amongst the countries. Like, we think that this is good, because in that case, we get a system of global investment going on, and this is much better than just having a single country putting out, you know, money and then taking the risk all on their own. Yes?
So we've been talking a lot about generating debt in our first point. When you talk about these unstable economies like the United States, how is it that you can, like, then say that that has nothing to do with the debt that they generated for themselves?
We don't think that's the problem. We think the analysis, like, that they provided is sufficient. And, like, if you want to, like, actually, you know, provide more analysis, please try an POI later on. Like, we think that they did a brilliant job. Anyways, like, we think that there's a fundamental thing that's been missed out on this debate. Like, we think that the benefits, like the essential benefits of having these international financial institutions is to increase, like, financial ratings within countries, like making it easier for people to invest in them. Like, we've heard this entirety of, like, oh, some countries get lower interest rates. Yes, that's because that's how they have, you know, worse risk, right? But, like, we've already heard, like, there are already, like, these mechanisms, like, you know, having criteria in countries, like, you know, making them less corrupt, not more corrupt, but less corrupt, and just, you know, having these criteria, right? We think that this allows for more private investment to come in because, like, surely, if a country is more stable, private investors will want to go into that country. Like, obviously, if, you know, there's corruption, even if there's war or something like that, people don't want to invest in that. Like, this is probably one of the reasons Greece is, you know, not a lot of people are investing in Greece and so on. But, you know, by having these financial institutions helping out and pretty much legitimizing them by saying, look, we're backing Greece, maybe you should invest in them. We're covering the problems, right? We think that there's more investment. Then we have this entirety of, like, you know, allowing domestic commercial, like, that sector to grow. Like, foreign direct investment leads to entrepreneurship. Like, it's, like, we've heard these, like, you know, alternatives about entrepreneurship, but they're completely false. Like, they think that these entrepreneurs are just going to spring out of nowhere. The thing is, you need foreign direct investment that goes into the commercial banks in those countries. Without that foreign direct investment, without any type of investment into these banks can't lend money to domestic entrepreneurs. That means no entrepreneurs, no domestic industry, no growth. Great, you just killed the developed world. Anyways, then we have this entirety of, like, the, well, preventing inflation. Like, we think that hyperinflation sucks when your money becomes worthless. Like, pretty much you can't import as much and your quality of life goes down. Like, we think that by having financial institutions advising you, giving you guidance, you can basically prevent that from happening. Then we have, like, lastly, this huge point on the representation on a global scale. Like, how does this work? We think that the World Trade Organization, you know, the World Bank and IMF, they have trade negotiators, like most countries in the world that are members. Like, we think that, you know, they also have representation, like a lot of the, you know, people on the board and so on of these organizations are from different continents, some of them are elected, and so on and so on. Like, we think that this is good. Like, why is this good? Why is it good to have, like, you know, negotiators from around the world? Like, firstly, we think it encourages discourse, right? Like, this is pretty much like the diplomatic system of trade. Like, what we see is, firstly, there's discourse. Like, we have these you know, two countries might want to have a trade agreement. So they go to the the World Trade Organization, and the World Trade Organization stands up there, and they're a mediator for these two countries. Like, how can we get the best deal? How can we make sure we uphold, like, you know, international laws? And how do we, like, you know, make sure that the deal actually benefits both? Oh, and then maybe I might have the idea of, like, how do we make sure that, you know, we don't exploit people and, you know, have crappy, you know, work conditions and so on. Like, this is something that they've missed. Then we have, like, the fact that these organizations have an tremendous, like huge expertise in financial matters, right? And that advice is so valuable, and we think that they completely ignore that. Like, then we have this entirety of, like, contacts, right? These organizations have contacts in the private sector as well as the public sector, and by having this, they're pretty much creating a forum for global trade. Like, for instance, several African countries can get in touch with, you know, like, the governments of these countries can get in touch with, you know, private institutions, private companies, and they can pretty much say, okay, look, you want a railway in your country? This company can do it for a good price. They won't cheat you. That's good. Like, then we have, like, you know, the entirety of that. We think that they've completely just, like, underestimated, like, this entirety of, like, political puppets. Like, for instance, let's say that the U.S. or China invests in a country without the, you know, World Bank. There's always like strings attached. Like, sure, you know, and even then, like, there's no, like, guarantee that the interest rates would be even better there, because, like, you know, obviously when you have, like, one country risking more, they probably want higher interest rates anyways. But anyways, like, having this political agenda, we think that this harms, you know, world trade, because free trade overall, like, you know, promotes more global growth anyways. Just read any economics book, like, it explains it all. Like, then we have, you know, the US. Like, for instance, take the US. Like, they've only pretty much invested in two countries in Southeast Asia right now. That's South Korea and Japan, and that's because of political reasons. We think this is horrendous. Like, we think that they should, like, instead of that, we should have, you know, global organizations that pretty much, you know, advocate trading with more partners, like, not just two countries. I mean, sure, there might be diplomatic and, you know, political reasons behind this, but come on, like, we're in a globalized world where we kind of want to have everyone cooperating instead of just having these small cliques because of, you know, political alliances and so on. Like, another thing, and just lastly, like, having these meeting places between, like, the public and private sector inside these, you know, international financial institutions, we think that it creates fair contracts and it upholds international, like, trade laws. And, like, we think that this overall is just better. So because, you know, the benefits completely outweigh whatever they've said and their alternatives fall on our side, and because the representation, like, we don't see any way they can win.
Right, I would like to invite the first summary speaker of this round over to front.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we on Side Proposition have summed the debate down into 3 key questions. Number 1, is it going to harm the international community? Number 2, will the developing country be worse or better off? And lastly, is it going to generate more debt? Now, before I delve into my 3 questions of today, I'd like to take a look at what the extension speaker has just brought up and show you a couple of flaws in his argument that he's just stated. All right, so he talked a lot about this idea of international cooperation, right? And he's told us about these trade negotiators and these people who, like, you know, are like serve as a mediator between countries. Well, what we on Side Proposition would say to that is we think that they're actually overestimating what the World Bank can actually do. We think that it's not the role of the World Bank to play babysitter in the international community. We think that trade relations between 2 countries or more than 2 countries are sovereign affairs that they need to deal with. We don't think that it should be the role of, like, a bank to come in and try to tell these countries, like, oh, you should deal with it this way, oh, you should deal with it that way. Right, ladies and gentlemen? But furthermore, what we would also say that what Side Opposition keeps failing to ignore is that the World Bank, even though they are like a cooperation of countries who have come together, that they still do want profits, right? We don't see why a cooperation or a company would exist without some benefit to it. So we think that they will charge interest on, like, these potential, like, third world nations who, like, invest money or, like, put money in the banks just because they need it. Because in the end, what we think is that the World Bank will do what they think is necessary to get them the profits that they need. We don't think that they are solely, like, a fairy godmother, right, of the world. So we think that, like, that part falls on their side. All right, let's take a look at my first contention today about is it going to harm the international community. Now, as my partner Tatiana has already brought up in her extension, she's talked to you guys a lot about like how one country affects a lot of other countries, and I'm just going to be quickly elaborating on that because we don't think that we really heard that much rebuttal to this in our second closing opposition's extension speech. So I'm just going to like briefly elaborate on that a little bit. So what we think is that one country affects all the other people, right? As my partner has already brought up, in the case of America, that was just as purely like national, like within the country, like a scenario, right? And even in that case, it affected so many people. It got so many people bankrupt, so many people lost their jobs, lost their homes. But furthermore, what we would say to that is that that actually had an effect on the international community as a whole, even though they weren't like part of something, or they like weren't directly associated with something like the World Bank in that situation, right? We think that when America went into this crisis, when they went into such a depression and such a recession, that this affected all the other countries in the world. We think that places such as Canada, places such as all the European countries, even the Asian countries, that they also in turn were affected by this because they also went into a recession and depression of their sort, and the whole entire international global economic community was put into a deficit. But furthermore, let's take a look at the European Monetary Bank. Right, and my partner briefly mentioned this, but I'm going to like go into depth on that a little bit more. So she brought up the example of Greece, right, about how Greece failed, but it's in the Eurozone, and now a lot of the other European countries are struggling to try to keep it alive. Well, they've talked a lot about the euro. Well, let's take a look at the euro, ladies and gentlemen. We on side proposition don't actually believe that the euro is a good thing. Sure, the Eurozone is great. It like joins countries together, but in the end, what we think, ladies and gentlemen, is that a country needs its sovereignty. A country needs its independent currency because that is what defines a country. That is what defines a lot of a country's sovereignty, right? And when you have something like the euro, when you have so many countries coming together to like have one current international currency, we think that this is actually bad, right? Let's take a look at Britain. No, thank you. Let's take a look at Britain. Let's take a look at the UK, right? Why is their currency so much like better, and why is their economy so much better than like the pound or like the Eurozone right now, right? We think that when you have so many countries together that are mutually dependent, that when one country fails, that it's going to bring down the rest of the countries in it as well. So now let's take a look at my second question of today, which is, will the developing country be worse or better off? And side proposition has told you today, side opposition has told us how private investments right now can't actually check up on like corrupt nations, and they don't know where the money is going. Well, first of all, what we would say to that is we don't think that these international corporations like the IMF, like the World Bank, that they actually have the resources to do so as well, right? We don't think they're going to go into every single developing country and check up on every single thing, every single corporation. We don't think that like that's true, right? Let's take a look at the World Health Organization. We don't think that like they have the energy and they have all the resources to go into these developing countries and check up on like the health stats on everything. So we don't think that the international bank and the community can do so as well. Sure.
Okay, the entire expansion on proposition side says that when one country falls, we all fall. But what we see in practice is that 70% of the money that is keeping Greece from falling is coming from the IMF and the World Bank, the same two institutions you're trying to abolish. So you're actually saying that in our world, your problems are solved.
Right, okay, I was actually going to get to that. Ladies and gentlemen, they've also talked to you a lot about like this whole idea of private investments, right? About how like people aren't going to want to invest in like a failing country. But we don't think that private investments are actually investing in the country itself. We think that they're investing in what the country has the potential to do. We think that yes, in the case of Greece, even without the IMF, even without the World Bank, that they still potentially could survive, because as long as they have the adequate resources, that private companies and private corporations are still going to want to invest and to want to bail them out. They're not going to say, oh, just because you're a failing country, we're going to like not care about you. We think that if Greece has the potential, that these companies are still going to try to make the best they can out of it, right? And also, there's been a lot of conflict about whether or not the developing country is able to handle this money. Side proposition today has told you that, side opposition has told you that like giving them the money won't help. But what we think that, we've told you that giving them money isn't going to help, because we think that it's going to go into a lot of things like the military, like dictatorship, but not actually going to like help the people of their country, right? Let's take Iran, like the nuclear, program that's going on. We think that like a lot of their investments are going into that. And lastly, let's take a look at my last question about is it going to generate more debt? And side opposition today seems to think that no, that it's not going to, that you need to give a country money to invest. But side proposition firmly believes that the answer is no. That what we think is that the government shouldn't, the government isn't going to be putting their money into this. But furthermore, we think that when you add money on top of money on top of money, that this isn't going to do anything. You have to start at the bottom and work your way to the top. Just adding money without any meaning to it, that this isn't going to bail the countries out of the debt or out of the recession that you're in, right? Well, let's take a look at moving on. And they've told us that trade between nations is too expensive. We think that it's their own problems. It's their problem to solve their own problems, and we think that they could create free trade agreements, and that is why we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, now I would like to invite the final speaker of this round to hold his speech.
Thank you. Okay, that was a lot. Give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man how to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. Let this government help the poor man, and they will go to his country, they will drag him to the river, they will make him fish all the fish in the river so there's nothing left, and they will take this fish and leave him with the bones. That's what foreign aid by governments does. Foreign aid by governments is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. That's exactly what you avoid by cooperating with international financial institutions instead of governments. Because governments act in self-interest. It's just the law of nature of economics. They act in self-interest, they want to make profit, they want to flourish their own economies. They think more in short term because the politicians need to be re-elected and all that. This is something we don't see in organizations like the IMF or the ECB. They think in long term, they think of surviving as a whole unit, they think of helping each other. This is something that was condemned ridiculously by this bench, but we think that is ridiculous because helping out each other if someone falls is a good thing, and I'll go through that more in my speech. What I'll divide the clashes into is not something superficial like, let's talk about this organization and this. I'll divide it into themes and talking about firstly the economics of it, and secondly the effects that follow that are both social and political. So let's get to the first part and deal with what this bench has said on the economics of it. So first thing we heard from the opening team is mainly, these poor developing countries are being treated unfairly. They're getting unfair rates. And we already clarified that this is not unfair. It's just different because there is a different risk. It's just basic economics. And secondly, they told us, well, it's better to deal with more stable economies. Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. It's better to deal with economies of international institutions who have more stable economies than the US or China, as the farmer has explained to you. Now, after that, they told us, well, the US needs to be a mentor for these countries. It needs to help them. No, it's not a mentor. It's a government is acting in self-interest. It goes there, it doesn't care about the working conditions of these people, it doesn't care if they suffer, it doesn't care if they have shitty quality of life. They want to produce right now and take it back, right? So it doesn't really help. Now, then they told us in their extension, well, what happens if all countries are in one organization, one big organization? What happens? Well, global trade happens. That's what happens. Yeah, it's a problem that they're all in the same. They followed that by telling us, well, having the euro as one currency for a lot of countries is a bad thing. No, it's not. That's ridiculous. If a country is independent, it'll do better. And they give us the example of Great Britain. But what you need to know about Europe is these countries are different. The countries that chose not to be in the euro have their reasons. So Great Britain, sure, it doesn't serve them well. But for example, for Germany, if it had an independent currency, it would never be able to sell to other countries because it's too high for them. Because these Eastern European countries, for example, would have too low a currency to actually buy from Germany. Then Germany will produce for nothing and won't be able to produce, for example. And this is, you already like took down our strongest economy. So that's not very nice of you. Now, later they told us, well, when one goes down, everyone goes down with them. And their main example for this, they told us when Greece went down, you know, everyone just got together and tried to help them so that they survive, and without them, it wouldn't have survived. And they were claiming that this is a bad thing. I don't understand how, like, that just doesn't make sense in my mind. So if we have to suffer a little bit, like a little bit of austerity in some countries so that we can help out our neighbors and make them survive, in their words, we'll do that very happily so that in the long term we can open trade and we can flourish together, you know? And then they told us, well, private investment will still go in anyway because people won't just be repelled because the economy is not stable. That's not true. As a private investor, I'm looking for somewhere where I'm going to make money. And I think that when I'm looking for somewhere where I can make money, I'm going to look at these organizations, these amazing international organizations who check everything, who have information and statistics about everything. They know how these countries are dealing with corruption. They know how these countries are dealing with their working conditions. They know how these economies are moving. And they will recommend this country for me, as the farmer explained to you. They will go, you know, this country has done well in this way, and recommend that you invest there. And people will go and invest there. And that's one of the biggest benefits of being part of these cooperations. So what we told you on this side is we told you a lot about the global investment that will be created and how the foreign DI will create more entrepreneurship because people will have money to actually make an entrepreneurship, make a business. You know, you need that for that. And we told you about the promotion that these organizations can create globally for both private enterprises and governments to go in and do that. So this diplomacy point that Alex brought to you is, I can explain it further by giving you a real example. For example, there was the problem with the US and the South American countries, where the South American countries produced cotton very cheaply, and they were, you know, going forward more than the US, so they left the US behind on this production. The US got pissed, and there was going to be a conflict about this. What happened is that one of these organizations that stepped in and made a deal that the US would substitute these countries so they would get paid more, but the US can subsidize them, so the US wins too. So what happened with the cooperation with the International Monetary Fund is that the US won because they still kept their investments, and the South American countries still kept their production and their selling, and they got paid more for it. How wonderful is that? And abolishing that and not cooperating with organizations that solve problems like this is just ridiculous. Now, secondly, we talked about the social and political effects. We told you there is a lot of political influence that can come with this if you go with this team and what they propose in their alternative. They have no criteria. They have no criteria of, you know, this is we don't want corruption, we want the money to go into this or that. They don't have that. Our opening team pointed that out brilliantly by saying, you know, we make sure they actually spend this money on this or on that. And that's a really good thing, because we've told you that what they act in is just self-interest, is in exploitation, it can be. So what is the difference between them and us? That's it. They look for profit, we look for global profit. We think if it's global profit, then it's not really self-interest, it's more like, you know, self-interest of humanity, which we can see as a bad thing, right? So what we create to you is a less corrupt systems, because we tell these countries, you know, if you're still using corruption, we're not going to give you the money. We have an eye on you. We can see everything. We can see where this money goes. We're not going to give you that. And then if they abide by these rules, they get really good benefits, because we represent them on the global scale with a stronger representation, because a small country like Somalia would not be able to compete in the world. But if they're part of a big organization, their name comes up in the big organization. So then it leads to these countries striving for these good conditions and this good area. So because we told you about the global investments and the global benefits that come, and because we told you about the representation that these countries benefit from, we don't see how we don't win this debate. Thank you.